We need sensible green leadership. It won't be easy, and it will require a wholly new kind of politics. A politics that is transparent and the space for a better, more honest debate about how we secure the country's long-term interests.
But is it honest to still insist the UK can hit net zero by 2050? The PM's dumped some of Boris Johnson's commitments. The former PM is furious. But will it cost us all more in the long run? We'll talk live to a former Tory Energy Minister and ex-Chancellor, Labour's Shadow Environment Secretary, and a Conservative MP who's chair of the Commons Environmental Audit Committee. Is the Prime Minister right? Also tonight, in the latest in our series on the asylum system and immigration, we report around the country on how the activists described as far right are accused of infiltrating protests against asylum hotels.
I don't want somebody coming with their agenda and using my protest, not just mine, obviously the people who are against genuine protest, very genuine, kind people who are welcoming. We don't want to be tarred with the same brush as those who are maybe there for other reasons.
Good evening. It sounds so simple, it makes you wonder why no one said it before. Rishi Sunak says the UK can still hit its net zero target by 2050 and it can push back some of the Conservatives' big green commitments. It's a major shift and sets up big dividing lines between the Tories and Labour ahead of the next election. You've probably heard the details by now that Mr Sunak's delayed a ban on the sales of new petrol and diesel cars, pushed it back from 2030 to 2035, in line with Germany and France. And he says there will be far more time to transition from boilers to heat pumps. The reason, he says, is because the targets we had until yesterday would impose costs on people of £5,000, £10,000, £15,000. He insists the UK doesn't have to impose those costs on anyone and we can still hit that 2050 target. Is he right? We'll put that to Labour's Shadow Environment Secretary, Steve Reid, a Conservative ex-Energy Minister and former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, Conservative MP Philip Dunn, who chairs the Environmental Audit Committee. First, let's have a word with Nick. This seems like a big deal, is it?
Well, Victoria, as far as Rishi Sunak is concerned, this goes way beyond climate. In his mind, he effectively launched phase 2 of his premiership today. And in his final peroration, he talked about how we are going to change the way our politics work. So he's casting himself as the change candidate. Change from all the prime ministers who went before him. Change from the guy who wants to succeed him as Prime Minister. And that change has two big themes on climate and on wider areas. The first one is being honest with people and telling them about what costs are involved. The second one is being prepared, as he did today, to challenge consensus and then to adapt. So for him, phase 2 of his premiership now is addressing what he called longer term questions. That follows phase 1, which was about bringing stability. The challenge for Rishi Sunak is if you become Prime Minister not with a general election, you just succeed to it and you want to be the change candidate, you probably need to stamp that message on day one. So has that message come too late? OK, so somehow he is different or has changed and he's apparently stopped various things as well. Yes, well, this tweet we had from Rishi Sunak this afternoon, we should be able to see it here, has got a lot of attention where the Prime Minister said that he's managed to stop a series of measures. So no taxes on eating meat, no new taxes to discourage flying. You won't be forced to sort your rubbish into 7 different bins, no compulsory car sharing and no expensive insulation upgrades. I do have to say, I don't think many powerful people were talking about putting new taxes on meat or forcing you to share your car, but I do have to say we did manage to track down one quite powerful person who quite liked the idea of sorting your rubbish into lots of bins.
Recycling, and that is the thing that in our house we are obsessive about. I know it's a pain, you need lots of bins, but it is something that is very good for the environment. OK, that was the leadership debates just over a year ago. Time flies.
What are the parties saying?
Well, we have a divided Conservative Party. So Boris Johnson, as you were saying, not happy. Liz Truss, she is happy. But interestingly, sort of the middle ground Conservative MPs who are concerned about what the party described in its last general election manifesto as the climate emergency, they are giving this a guarded welcome. For the Labour leadership, they're accepting the boiler announcement. As you were saying, on cars, they will restore the 2030 target for phasing out petrol and diesel cars. It will be interesting to see if that 2030 target for Labour does make it all the way to their general election manifesto, because Keir Starmer does have a habit of removing things that could be awkward in a general election, and he may be thinking carefully about whether, if he sticks with that, the Tories might depict him as the enemy of the motorist.
Thank you very much, Nick. The aim of net zero, it's worth reminding ourselves, is for the UK to take out of the atmosphere as many greenhouse gas emissions as it puts in. And as you know, the government has legislated to reach net zero in this country by 2050. Let's talk to Philip Dunn, Conservative MP and Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, former Chancellor, Business Secretary and Climate Change Minister Kwasi Kwarteng, and Steve Reid, Labour's Shadow Environment Secretary. Welcome all of you. Philip Dunn, first of all. So according to Rishi Sunak, the UK can reach net zero in 2050, even with delaying some of these commitments, and it's not going to cost anyone anything. That is brilliant. How come no one's thought of that before?
Well, I think what the Prime Minister did today was, first of all, as you've just said, reconfirm his commitment to net zero, the ambition for the UK to continue to show leadership internationally on this. And I think that was very important because people have been raising questions about where he really stood, and I think he's made that very clear. Secondly, what he's done is to look at some of the short-term policies, the immediate policies that were either unsettled, and some of the boiler issues, the energy efficiency measures were subject to consultation but hadn't yet been finalised. He's realised, as our committee said to him in a report, said to the government in a report a couple of years ago, that the numbers on which these policies had been based were underestimates of the cost it will take, for example, to make your home energy efficient, to be able to work properly with a heat pump. So he's moved those to one side, deferred them until the technology and the supply chain is ready to install them. I think that's a sensible, pragmatic measure. And you mentioned the car issue. Well, in relation to electric vehicles, all the major countries around the world where cars are manufactured, who have introduced bans of new sales of ICE, of petrol and diesel engines, have gone to the 2035 date. So it's bringing us into line with the rest of the country. I think it's a pragmatic. I very much welcome the commitment to net zero. I very much welcome the commitment to parliamentary scrutiny of the carbon budgets, which we've not had up until now.
The Climate Change Committee, in its 6th carbon budget, said if we phased out petrol and diesel cars in 2032, so 2 years after the government was promising until today, it would take out 90 million tonnes of carbon dioxide and lead to savings of 6 billion across 30 years, compared to allowing petrol and diesel being sold up to 2035. So what is the government going to do instead to take 90 million tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere?
Well, the Prime Minister today said that we are on track on our carbon budgets. That is true for Carbon Budget 4 and Carbon Budget 5. Carbon Budget 6, the CCC says we're currently at 91% of where we need to be. So we're edging towards that.
If you're pushing one commitment back, but insisting you can still reach 2050, you've got to make it up somewhere else. So what is the plan?
So we'll have to see. And the Committee on Climate Change is going to be, I assume, looking at this announcement today and will make its projections clear.
There is actually a plan?
Oh, well, I think that this is a very, very complex proposition to decarbonise the whole economy. I understand.
So
there are swings and roundabouts all around.
Of course, and you would have thought with the announcement today, the swings and the roundabouts, the T's would have been crossed, the I's would have been dotted. Do you think there actually is a plan?
I think there is a plan. I think a lot of companies are already demonstrating. So we've seen. Well, he told us a lot about it today. But
Not really.
Well, it's a speech. You can't expect all the detail to be there, and we'll see it getting on. He said that the Chancellor would be making a statement with the Energy Secretary on the energy efficiency measures. There will be a whole set of measures coming forward. He said, which I was also encouraged by, that he'll be going to COP28, where he'll be standing in front of the world confirming his commitments, and he will be making a speech on nature before he goes, and that's another big area that wasn't really covered in the speech other than in that respect.
Climate Change Committee 3 months ago warned the government was already dangerously close to missing being on track for net zero in 2050. That was before today. Now they are questioning whether 2050 can be met. I mean, you must be what you care deeply about 2050.
We have a responsibility for scrutinising it, so we do, and we take it very seriously.
But they don't know if it can be met now.
Well, look, we're talking about 2050. That's many years away. There are lots of things will go right and go wrong. The technological innovation is coming in apace. We've had the take-up of electric vehicles, just to go back to that, much faster than had been predicted. Over 800,000 have been sold, I think I'm right in saying, so far this year, or in the last 12 months, which was a huge increase. It's almost quadruple what happened last year. So it's the market is moving the dial ahead of the predictions from the experts, and this may well continue in other areas. So I'm not despondent about this. I think this is a pragmatic set of measures which will help us get there.
Thank you very much, Philip Dunn. Thank you. Let's talk to Kwasi Kwarteng then, Energy Minister between 2019 and 2021, then Business Secretary. Good evening to you.
Hello.
What do you think about the announcement today?
Well, look, I think there were elements of it that I fully agreed with, and I like the pragmatism. I was concerned about pushing out the date for ICE's phase out, the internal combustion engine. Philip mentioned the fact that there's been a huge take-up for electric vehicles. Of course there has. The target 2030 has really focused the minds of manufacturers. That's what's accelerating and driving a lot of the transition, a lot of the change. And my worry is that if you push that out, you're sending the wrong signal. As Business Secretary, I used to go to places all around the country, particularly in Sunderland in the northeast, and there was huge amounts of capital that was being deployed because they felt that we had very, very strong and very ambitious targets, and they wanted to get behind that movement. And of course, there is some concern. I mean, Philip hasn't expressed this concern, but there is concern within the party that if we relax those targets, we won't crowd in the investment, and it will be to the detriment of jobs and wealth creation.
Mr. Sunak said it was in response to the cost of living and that people are struggling to make ends meet. There might be some of our viewers saying, look, we wouldn't be in this position today if you and Liz Truss hadn't crashed the economy a year ago.
I would say that. I mean, we could talk about interest rates. We can talk also about the fact that and I'm here to talk about net zero. In terms of net zero
but there
in the
is a
industry,
link, isn't there, between the cost of living and what Rishi Sunak is doing today,
so there is a
according
cost.
to him.
There is a link to it. But all I would say about that is that with respect to the cars, which I was talking about, the electric vehicles, that's not something that necessarily is going to affect the cost of living. But what it does do is that it encourages people to investors to invest in the energy transition. And I'm not going to relitigate, you know, my period as Chancellor. I mean, that wasn't something that I was asked to be. I know, it's fine.
Sure.
I mean, you're perfectly entitled to do that.
In terms of the costs on people, Rishi Sunak said he was not going to impose £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 on people. He said it was not right for people in Westminster to do that. I mean, he's got a point.
I think he
People are
does.
struggling.
I think he does. But with respect to one particular policy, the rest of the statement I thought was very strong. And I think his temperament and his approach is right. It's got to be a balanced approach. We're not eco-extremists, but at the same time, we're not climate change deniers. We think that there's a real opportunity in the transition. But with respect to the 2030 date, that was something that he signed up to as Chancellor. That was something the whole government signed up to all the time I was in government.
Do you ever remember him raising any objections to that 2030
Well,
date?
I mean, we had discussions, and I think he had some doubts, but in the end, we all signed up to it.
He could have resigned as Chancellor if he felt so strongly about it.
In the end, he did, but on another issue.
For very different reasons.
But I'm very sure of the fact that when I spoke to industry players, investors, they were very impressed at the ambition that we described, that we set forward. And the 2030 date was very much in people's minds. And that's why it crowded in investment. And that's why the take-up that Philip is lauding happened, because we had these ambitious targets.
What was it like to hear the Home Secretary on the radio today saying that 2030 target was an unrealistic and an arbitrary target?
Well, every target is arbitrary. I mean, how can the target not be arbitrary? No, I was surprised that she said it was unrealistic, because that was what we were all working to. Every investor I spoke to in the sector was looking at the 2030 target. Some people had issues with it, but they just got on and made their plans accordingly. And that was, I think, something that was very good for job creation.
Mr. Sunak said today, you don't reach net zero simply by wishing it, yet that's precisely what previous governments have done. Does that sound like he's trashing your record, Boris Johnson's record?
What was so extraordinary about that was that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 2.5 years in those previous governments. I mean, it was not that as if he was a backbencher or someone with little influence. I mean, he was right at the centre of it.
He said that?
I thought that was odd to say that previous governments had wished it, because I had lots of discussions with him, very fruitful discussions, when we were both in cabinet, and he was very, very open-minded and very dynamically involved in net zero policy.
The government's moved the goalpost then for business today, whether you like it or not, whether business like it or not, and we know that the boss of Ford is pretty angry. How important is it for business now that the timetable does actually stick to 2035 for the ban on petrol?
You referred to my period last year as Chancellor, and of course I know fully well that uncertainty is something that markets and investors cannot withstand. They want certainty, they want direction, and on this I think we need to have a degree of certainty. I was quite surprised also that Labour immediately said that they would reverse it back, because if they're going to stick with that, that creates in itself a whole bunch of uncertainty, because on the outcome of the election will determine whether this target is 5 years
but I'm asking you,
or not.
Is it crucial now that we stick to 2035
I think
for business?
The government has made its bed and it should lie in it and stick to that date.
Thank you very much. Let's bring in Shadow Environment Secretary Steve Reed. Businesses want certainty. You've already said you're going to switch back to 2030 if Labour win the next general election. You're going to cause them more uncertainty.
Well, you have to look at why Rishi Sunak has done this. This is an act of weakness from a directionless Prime Minister. You have to question whether this government actually has an economic or an industrial strategy. He's actually throwing away one of the greatest opportunities, economic opportunities of the 21st century, which is for the UK to lead the world in the transition to the green economy with all the jobs that will bring. He's causing huge uncertainty in the business world, and he's deterring inward investment by what he's done. All of that is the result of this short-term, narrow, what he sees as narrow party political advantage. But I think even that, we've just heard around the table, is blowing up in his face.
Okay.
Now,
I'm asking about Labour. If Labour win the next general election, you've already said you're going to reverse it to 2030. You must accept that will create more uncertainty.
Well, the election will come within 12 months. A lot of the investment from the motor industry has already gone in towards 2030.
So when the Tories change things, it creates uncertainty. But if Labour change things, what, it doesn't create uncertainty?
The Sunak is telling those companies to write off the investments that they've made. We're not going to do that.
When did he say that?
By scrapping the target that they're working towards, he's undermining the investment that they've already put in. And it's not just me that's saying that. You've had the chairman of Ford saying that. You've had other captains of industry saying that. As the big global investors are looking at which country to invest in as we transition to this new economy, are they going to pick a government which is stable and predictable in their approach to the green economy, or are they going to choose a flip-flopper?
On the subject of
flip-flopping,
are you sure Sir Keir Starmer is going to switch it back to 2030 if Labour win? Because he's done a few flip-flops in his time.
Well, absolutely. He's completely committed to Labour's green prosperity plan.
He was committed to scrapping tuition fees. He was committed to bringing public utilities into...
He's committed to Labour's green prosperity plan, of which this is just one small part. So if you look at the proposals Labour has to create GB Energy, a publicly owned company that will direct private as well as public money into renewable
He was
forms of energy.
committed to scrapping the top rate of income tax for the top 5%. He's changed his mind on that.
The Green Prosperity Plan is the absolute centre of Labour's offer.
And you've pushed that back.
It's what will...
So you're allowed to push stuff back, but the Tories aren't.
That is a misunderstanding of what Labour's doing.
No, it's absolutely what's happening. You're pushing back your investment.
You can't come in as a government and spend 28 billion in year one without having done the preparatory work.
Well, that's what you promised originally.
Labour will get up to that level during the first term of a Labour government. You actually cannot spend that much in year one because you have to do the work. So this is sensible phasing in.
You didn't say that at the beginning when you first promised
It's the sensible. Rachel Reeves has been absolutely clear, the Shadow Chancellor, this is how we'll do it. You have to build up towards spending that much. You have to take the private sector with you as you do it. But there's a prize here. One country in the world is going to become the leader in the transition to the green economy. Our country, for a century, because of the Industrial Revolution, achieved huge economic benefits. That prize is there again, and today Rishi Sunak threw it out the window.
Do you want to impose costs of £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 on people?
The reason that Labour wants to help transition the economy is because we can cut people's bills. If the kind of investment in sustainable energy that I was just talking about through GB Energy will give us not only a more secure supply of energy, so we're no longer dependent on volatile dictators like Vladimir Putin. We create our energy at home, more secure supplies, but crucially lower bills. To lower bills. Are you talking about the heat pumps issue there? That was not a target Labour ever set. That was a government target that they've now jettisoned. You can't impose additional costs on families at a time like this without having, first of all, put in the investment that will make heat pumps of a comparable cost to the kind of conventional boilers people are using now.
Which is what the scrappage scheme does, by increasing by 50% to £7,500 a grant to anybody for changing their fossil fuel boilers.
Yes.
Will you match that?
Labour never subscribed to that proposal.
No, it's come out today from the government, and are you supporting it?
What we've talked about is investing public and private money into making sure we get this transition so we can cut household bills. Okay. It's the Conservatives that were proposing to whack them up in the first place. They've now had to reverse.
I've got to pause it there. I would have had you all in a conversation, but I was told you all wanted to be done separately. But next time maybe we'll converse.
I'm not sure what the deal was, actually.
Oh, OK. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for talking to our audience. Thank you. All week, we've been looking at the impact of the asylum system on the UK, and we've a live studio debate on the issue tomorrow. Tonight, an investigation by BBC Newsnight has found that groups described as far-right have organised or attended 50 protests since the start of the year, mostly focused on hotel accommodation for asylum seekers. The groups, who operate across the country, have been accused of infiltrating legitimate community organised protests in a bid to spread what has been described as their extreme ideology. Their members include individuals who've engaged in openly racist behaviour and who've expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler. Just to warn you, the following film contains some extremely offensive content. Yasmin Arakan reports on the protests.
These are just some of the protests that have taken place in 2023.
Nazis! Off our streets! Off our streets!
Small boats, asylum seekers and migrants has become a political battleground and an issue for communities across the country.
They are not refugees, they are illegal immigrants.
Why are these people who are illegal, they have no documentation, why are they being given a 4-star hotel?
Here in Llanelli, people have been protesting about plans for asylum seekers to be placed in a 4-star hotel. They say it's important to the local economy. But this situation has given leverage to groups described as far-right who are taking advantage of the tensions and infiltrating community organised protests. One of them is Patriotic Alternative, a group run by Mark Collett, a former leading member of the British National Party who's expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler and recommends Mein Kampf to his supporters. Matt Collins is a former member of far-right groups who now works for Hope Not Hate, a group who campaigns against them.
These people are quite skilled at getting into communities and causing trouble and stirring things up. The Patriotic Alternative are incredibly active. They're not a particularly large organisation, but they're incredibly active and incredibly dedicated.
I'd say there's maybe around 400 people here today. These protests are getting bigger and bigger.
The group's ideology is based around the far-right conspiracy theory of white genocide, a rhetoric that falsely claims there is a covert plan to replace white populations with ethnically diverse communities. On their ideology, Patriotic Alternative told us, the plan to replace white Britons is not a covert plan, as you falsely claim, but an overt attempt to reduce the indigenous people of these islands to a minority in their own ancestral homeland.
We've talked about some of them, the Great Replacement Theory, white supremacism, neo-Nazism. That is what I would describe as unlawful terrorist activity that would put them right in the crosshairs of MI5 and counter-terrorism policing.
The town of Furness has attracted attention from groups described as far-right from outside the area. But there are groups getting involved in a local protest closer to home, in the form of Voice of Wales, who describe themselves as investigative journalists and travel the UK to conduct interviews.
Well, look, it makes you question absolutely.
One Voice of Wales member has a strong history of affiliation to other hard-right groups, and another James Harvey from the Voice of Wales student wing is seen questioning the Holocaust. What you're about to hear is extremely offensive.
You look into Hitler and you look into what the Nazi Party did, and I'm not defending them at all, but 6 million Jews weren't killed. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the concentration camps, most of them weren't equipped with gas chambers.
And here, Dan Morgan and James Harvey discussing the ban on Tom Jones' song Delilah from International Rugby in Cardiff.
In the stadium, because apparently it was sung, but apparently it wasn't heard. Yeah. Now, I don't know much about that, but
I was thinking it's not Somalian enough, really, is it? For Cardiff, that's what they want. They want the Somalian anthem. Did they have what is their anthem? Just
I couldn't tell you, to be honest with you. No, I wouldn't even do that.
Voice of Wales said the comments made by Mr Harvey had been taken out of context. He has since clarified his position. He fully believes that the genocide and horrific mass murder of millions of people, Jews and others, took place during World War II. The group failed to explain the comments and hand gestures used when discussing Somalis. Patriotic Alternative and Voice of Wales are different groups with different members, goals and beliefs, but both groups travel around the country in a bid to spread their message. For the first time, we've been able to track the movements of these two groups, finding out where they are protesting and which places they repeatedly return to. Analysis by BBC Verify and Newsnight shows they cumulatively organised or attended 50 protests since the start of the year, with the vast majority focusing on accommodation for asylum seekers. They've been all over the UK, including Scotland, but favour some areas with multiple visits to the same location, like Long Eaton and Haydock. You might remember the Nosy demonstration, which quickly descended into violence, resulting in a police van being set on fire. And here you can see the Voice of Wales protest in blue. The majority in Wales, but some have spilled over the border into England, like in Portland, Manchester and Scampton. And like Patriotic Alternative, they return to the same sites multiple times, with their key focus on Swansea and Llanelli.
I think there are two things here. People have a genuine concern about large quantities of people coming into areas for the pressure that they're putting on local service, the schools, the doctors, and everything else. Whether they are people coming from abroad or big developments mean huge pressure on local services, those are legitimate concerns. What we're seeing here, though, are people who have no local interests. They're just anti-immigrant. They're racists. And they want to take advantage of people who have got genuine local concerns in order to push their own racist agendas.
The idea that they would be using a local protest who might have legitimate concerns about immigration, if that balanced debate is hijacked by people who start talking about invasion and start talking about these people being dangerous, that's an extremist conversation. It drives a polarised debate. It means people from the extreme right wing get very heated, which means people protesting against them from the extreme left get very heated, and then you're going to see violence, and then you're going to see a problem for law and order.
The Bibby Stockholm is moored in Dorset. It's currently empty, but forms part of efforts by the Home Office to reduce the £8 million daily bill to taxpayers by moving asylum seekers out of hotels and into alternative accommodation. It's caused some unease amongst locals and has been jumped on by both Patriotic Alternative and the Voice of Wales.
The reason why Voice of Wales is here is because this affects everybody in the United Kingdom. The tap needs turning off.
Unlike Voice of Wales, Patriotic Alternative organises protests, such as this one here in Portland. It was a small group and it had a low turnout. One of them was Michelle Vardy, a concerned local, who we also found had been posting in anti-asylum Facebook groups.
This is a poor area and a lot of people, they can't even afford to feed their children 3 meals a day in the school holidays, yet they've seen a barge coming in and our government is paying for 3 meals a day for them.
And would it worry you if you knew that the leader of that group has sympathies towards Adolf Hitler, for example?
If that's the case, yes, but I also understand that a lot of these groups that are against all the illegal immigrants coming here They always get slurred with far right and racist tendencies from other groups like Stand Up to Racism, when I'm not sure that's the case.
Michelle told us she engages with both left and right-wing groups on Facebook. "250 miles north in Wigan, another demonstration took place. Maureen O'Brien is a local independent councillor in Wigan. After listening to the concerns of constituents, she organised a small protest against the plans for residents, but it was infiltrated by Patriotic Alternative.
It was mainly, there's about 200 to 300 people came, very genuinely concerned people who live locally, and I think it's very unfair that the main hotel that they use for weddings, there's a lot of people employed here, are just losing that without consultation.
At that protest, a group called Patriotic Alternative came down. Did you know about that?
I'd put a post on Facebook stating no one from the far right, far left, any organisations like that were welcome. It was purely for genuinely concerned residents of Wigan and Standish. I think a few did turn up from, is it Patriotic Alternative? I'd never heard of them, I didn't know who they were. I don't want somebody coming with their agenda and using my protest, not just mine, obviously the people of Wigan's genuine protest, very genuine, kind people who are welcoming. We don't want to be tarred with the same brush as those who are maybe there for other reasons, pushing their own agenda. We don't want that.
Patriotic Alternative say they've been welcomed by communities all over the UK.
There is a very different agenda by some of these racist groups where they're talking about no more migrants, we're full, talking about white genocide, really trying to whip up fears, completely illegitimate fears amongst reasonable and moderate people. Those are the people we absolutely need to guard against.
As thousands continue to cross the channel in small boats and the urgent need to house asylum seekers persists, this is an issue that will continue to ignite communities and in turn gives far-right groups fertile ground to exploit existing tensions in a bid to spread their ideology.
Yasmin Arakan. Tomorrow on Newsnight, we're devoting our whole programme to a conversation off the back of the issues around the impact of the asylum system, featuring those who have crossed the channel in boats, former border force officials, experts on the law and the numbers, and those who want to reduce levels of immigration to this country. And we'll have the Immigration Minister and Shadow Immigration Minister live in the studio as we look at ways to try and solve the issue. Back to the main story of the day now. The PM has delayed some of the measures put in place to hit the legal target of hitting net zero by 2050. Earlier, we looked at the politics of his decisions. In a moment, we'll hear from someone representing landlords who've welcomed some of the announcements today, and from Energy UK, who don't. But how did we get here? And who is set to save money as a result? Here's Joe.
The Tories once said, vote blue and go green. The hugger-husky Prime Minister promised the greenest government ever. But David Cameron somewhat cooled off in office, reportedly telling advisers to cut the green crap. Now, Rishi Sunak was part of a government which laid out some of the most ambitious net zero targets in the world. But today, is he also dropping down a gear? He says policy should be proportionate and not burden working families. But will this current plan make reaching net zero by 2050 any more affordable? Whether net zero is an economic net loss or net gain depends on when you are asking. The blue line here shows the absolutely massive investment needed by the UK. According to the Independent Climate Change Committee, it'll likely hover around the £50 billion a year mark, that's 1.5% of GDP for decades. Now, if we add the red line, that's what is expected in savings. They will come, but very, very gradually, up to a point of around 60 billion a year by 2050. Now, if we split that difference, you can see when net zero is going to be losing its money, that's the next couple of decades, and then when it's saving its money. The estimate is in 2044, we will have a break-even point. So we've seen the picture for the UK as a whole, but what about consumers, many of whom have been hit by the high cost of living? Rishi Sunak today used one word 27 times, and that was change. And he framed all of these changes in terms of affordability and the cost of living. He said boiler upgrade grants will be more generous. But what about the longer transition from boilers to heat pumps? What will that mean for poorer people in rented accommodation?
Landlords won't be obliged to improve the efficiency of their homes.
And in England alone, there's nearly 3 million properties in the private rented sector that fall below the government's efficiency target, with more than 7 million people living in them. So this means that these people will not have any effort to make their energy bills lower because renters aren't going to spend their own money on improving the landlord's property.
And what about delaying the deadline on the sale of new diesel and petrol cars? Does it help those on low incomes? Drivers are, of course, told of the savings to be made on running costs of electric cars, but how does today's announcement regarding buying those cars filter through?
Poor households are much more likely to buy cars from the second-hand market, and what we see at the moment is new electric car sales are mainly big, expensive, costly to run electric vehicles. And when these do filter through into the second-hand market, these aren't the sort of cars that will be beneficial and will be attractive to low-income households.
Labour say that they would reverse delaying that deadline, but a poll from YouGov tonight suggests far more voters support the government's move than don't. And if you think the public will stay united on green policies, just look at Germany, where the ruling coalition has faced a public backlash over its plans on heat pumps. In the Netherlands, farmers have been kicking off about plans to cut animal numbers to curb nitrogen emissions, whilst coal-dependent Poland is fighting the EU to keep its coal subsidies. Climate policy whiplash isn't just a phenomenon here at home.
Well, here with some of the views of the industry and business are Dara Vias, Deputy CEO of Energy UK, who represent most of the firms that operate right across the energy sector, and Ben Beadle, who is a landlord and Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association. Welcome, both of you. I mean, you represent so many companies across the spectrum of the energy sector. Broadly, what's their reaction to today's announcements?
Look, I think broadly speaking, the Prime Minister was right to identify that we do need to kind of consider what that public conversation is about getting to net zero. But really, the biggest concern for the energy industry right now is what the pronouncements today, what signals they send to investors, and the investors that we desperately need to be investing in clean energy technologies right across the UK.
And what signals do you think it does send to investors?
I think what we need is stable, dependable, predictable policy and governance in this country, and we haven't had that. We are in a global race for investment, and countries like the USA, France, Germany, India, China, they're doing a lot to attract global investment in clean energy technology. It's about ensuring that we're investing in energy security, getting off fossil fuels, not relying on imported gas, and making sure our system's cleaner. And we're not sending those signals, and capital has a choice of location.
OK. Let me talk to Ben Beadle then. From a landlord's point of view, from your members' point of view, what do you make of the decision, particularly on more time for people to transition from boilers to heat pumps?
Yeah, I mean, we think the announcement is broadly sensible, but crikey, talk about creating a massive amount of uncertainty. We feel this is very avoidable because people have already taken steps to offload properties before these things were going to come in. And I do worry that many people have had to leave their homes because of so much uncertainty about the £10,000 cap and the direction of travel without a clear strategy. It's really problematic and totally avoidable.
What do you mean you worry that people will have had to leave their homes? What do you mean?
Well, because what happens is government announced this over 2 years ago, have said very little since. We've seen 2 years of dither and delay, and they announced their intentions that landlords would have to pay up to £10,000 in terms of improvements to get to an EPCC. And so what has happened is those underperforming properties have been exited from the sector, they've been lost from the sector, and tenants have been asked to leave their homes. Not in every case, granted, but landlords have taken steps to protect their investments. And as I say, my real worry here is that this dither and delay has really adversely affected the supply of homes when already we don't have enough. It's catastrophic.
Catastrophic? What do you say about that, Dara Vias?
I think that, the government should have considered the timescales for landlords, absolutely. I think there was a lot of delay. However, 1 in 4 households in the private renter sector are in fuel poverty. And Citizens Advice today put out figures saying that by the end of this year, people in private renter sector will have paid £1.1 billion more on bills than they would have had to if their homes were more efficient.
Wow. I mean, that's a massive sum. Does that suggest to both of you that you can push these things back, but in the end you'll pay more.
For me, I think what it means is that we need a proper plan and a proper delivery schedule. Ultimately, you know, in the UK, we've got amongst the leakiest homes in Europe. We do need to improve those homes. We do need to decarbonise the heat in those homes. The best kind of way to save money on energy is by using less and making our homes more efficient.
What do you say to that, Ben Beadle?
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. NRLA wants to see rented properties as energy efficient as possible, but government really needs to set out a proper strategy when it comes to achieving this. We heard from Kwasi Kwarteng in the previous piece saying that industry needs confidence. People need to know what the rules of the game are so that they can plan accordingly. And we need a carrot as well as stick. It's as simple as that.
David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, scrapped the insulation targets, for example. And there is analysis which suggests that as a result of that, several years on, we're paying something like £1.5 billion more in our energy bills.
Yeah, I mean, it added £9.8 billion to bills because it covered so much those green levies. It's made a huge difference, and I think, you know, when we're in a period where not that long ago prices had nearly trebled, government spent £10 billion of much needed support to help people with their energy bills last winter. It's absolutely right that we're doing the things we need, not only to help and support people to make changes that they need to their homes, but also to give the industry confidence. We need clean power, we need domestic clean power, and then we need people to be able to use it in their homes, in their vehicles, in their businesses. It is a system and it needs to work. And right now, that confidence just isn't there for the industry.
Okay. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Dara Veers, Deputy CEO of Energy UK, and Ben Beadle, who is from the National Residential Landlords Association and a landlord himself. Thank you very much. That's all from us tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Till then, have a good evening. See you then.